Great. Thank you everyone for joining us over this very special 1 hour for a fascinating panel event on women's work and economic security. My name is Caroline Stewart and I'm the CEO of Ecstra Foundation. Before I introduce our fantastic panelists, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. For us in central Sydney, that's the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. Ecstra Foundation, why us, why now, and how did we manage to convince such an amazing panel of women to join us for this webinar today? So Ecstra Foundation is a charitable foundation. We're a grant-making organisation. We work across government, community groups, academics, and the financial sectors, all united in the common cause of building the financial wellbeing of all Australians. So we work with over 100 grantees, and those programs range from small community-based organisations delivering what you would define as classic financial education through to large national multi-year partnerships. We acknowledge that the work of communities and individuals is really important, but we also think that beyond funding community-based programs, it's really important for philanthropy to play its part in supporting longer-term structural change. So supporting those organisations that are taking the longer-term view, are really tackling those long-term issues. And financial inequality, women's rights, is certainly one of those long-standing issues. So as I introduce the panelists, I'd like to say that Ecstra Foundation has the joy and the privilege of working with all these organisations and these fantastic women in different areas. I'm going to give you a very short version of their very long and impressive CVs, as you can look them up on Humanitics, but looking at the makeup of our audience today, many of you will be familiar with our panelists. So first of all, we've got Dr. Cassandra Goldie joining us, who is looking very calm, even though she's right in the middle of an incredibly busy day. So thanks, Cassandra, for joining us. She's obviously the CEO of ACOS, which may explain why she's in Canberra at the moment, which is the peak national body for the community sector. She's a long-standing expert in economic and social policy issues. She's on a number of different advisory boards, is a passionate advocator and a passionate educator. She also now has an AO to her name and was recently voted in, I think, or nominated and voted in as a pro bono Impact 25 leader, which is a fantastic endorsement, and it shows the depth of her experience and her expertise across many sectors. So thanks, Cassandra, for joining us. Secondly, we've got Danielle Wood joining us, CEO of the Grattan Institute. Thanks very much, Danielle. Danielle is also an expert commentator and a leading economist in social and budgetary issues. She is recently the co-author of Women's Work, the Effect of COVID-19 on Women. And we look forward to learning more about the outcomes from that report, some of the surprising ones, and the policy implications from that. And last but not least, in terms of our panelists, we have the lovely Mariam Mohammad joining us. Thanks, Mariam. Mariam is a long-term advocator and a very passionate women's rights advocate. She also is the founder and CEO of MoneyGirl, which is a social change consultancy and social change enterprise, which is working with women right across the spectrum, but particularly with a focus on women to build financial independence, and perhaps for those that wouldn't normally get the opportunity to do that. And finally, Catherine Fox has kindly agreed to be our moderator today. Catherine's very well known to all of us, and actually I could spend an hour just interviewing Catherine, but that's perhaps for another day. So Catherine is obviously a leading journalist, commentator and author. She was the long-term contributor to the AFR, running the Women and Corporate Women's column, but much more recently, she's the author of 5 books, and we often see Catherine leading the conversations around policy. Catherine is also on the board of Australians Investing in Women, which was previously known as the Australian Women's Donor Network. So thank you, Catherine. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the webinar format. The speakers, Catherine will introduce, and we do have a Q&A and a chat channel running. If you have any questions, please place those there. And as we complete the formal part of today's proceedings, we'll try to address some of those time permitting. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Catherine.
Thank you so much, Caroline and Ecstra Foundation, for having me along, but much more importantly, having our superstar panelists along today for this important discussion. Yes, I have been around this space for quite a long time. Clearly, I'm very young, but I started early. So I am particularly pleased to be able to contribute to any of these discussions. I'm also just thought I'd give you a few comments on where we are at the moment, because what an extraordinary sort of year, just over a year that we've been through, not to mention what's been unfolding around women, workplace sexual harassment and so on in the last few months, in fact. So much to discuss, and also my sincere hope that we're looking at a moment where we can actually grab some momentum and see some real change in outcomes for women. Many of these issues, as you've heard, I've been covering for many years at the Fin Review and in my books. And at the moment, we are seeing sort of a really awful combination of outcomes around domestic violence and mental health, homelessness, particular impact on women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds and Indigenous women. And of course, you probably noted just recently that Australia has slipped quite dramatically down the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index, which I've been covering again for a long time. So we've slipped quite right down to number 50, which given the fact that this is a fairly rich country and we do an incredibly good job on educating women and girls, is absolutely dire. So we've definitely seen some really awful outcomes. And of course, the pandemic has exacerbated some of those existing inequalities and made them even more acute. So we're going to hear more of that from the panelists shortly. Just remind you, as Caroline has already said, really happy to have comments and questions as we go through. We will come back to that. So around 1:15 or so, we will open up and answer them. So please keep an eye out and put them up as we go, because if there's something in particular you would like to have the panel discuss, let us know. Now, Caroline mentioned I'm on the board of Australians Investing in Women, and we in fact also put out a report, as well as Danielle's excellent work in March, looking at the real hotspots for women at this point. And one of the things we observed when we launched it last week with Leonora Rees and Angela Jackson, two other superb women economists, was how a lot of this discourse is really sitting at odds with some of the stuff we're reading about the economic recovery at the moment, the bounce back. So I wondered, Danielle, maybe if we can kick off, what's going on there? Because what you have uncovered and others have, and what we're discussing today, is some really poor outcomes for women. And yet we've got this rhetoric and indeed some evidence showing us that there has been a recovery at a faster rate than was expected. What's actually at play?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is, I mean, it's a complicated picture. So at the height of the lockdowns, what we saw was that women's employment outcomes suffered more. That was very clear in the data in terms of participation, in terms of employment, in terms of hours worked. Women's jobs took a much bigger hit. That looked really different to past recessions. Historically, recessions have actually hit male jobs a lot worse. So a lot of us were very concerned about what was going on there. It was overlaid, of course, as well with a big rise in unpaid work. And particularly for parents, a lot of parents will remember, some of the challenges of remote learning, losing informal care from grandparents, etc. That led to a sort of a big spike in unpaid work that was disproportionately borne by women, again, on top of what's already a higher load. So that interfaces, of course, with people's ability to participate in the workforce. As the economy has recovered, and it is right to say that it has recovered strongly than many of us were expecting. We're still on that recovery trajectory, but it has performed well. We have seen many jobs come back, and we have seen women's jobs recover as part of that. So after the lockdown ended, things reopened. Some of those jobs have come back. The concern really is what's twofold. Certain groups have not recovered at the same pace as others, and we point into our report. A particular group is single parents. 80% of those are women. They lost more jobs and hours at the height of the downturn I think it is that it was partly because of the sectors they tend to work for, ones where a lot of jobs were lost. It was partly that unpaid care. If you don't have anyone to share the burden of remote learning with, you pull out of the workforce to manage it. That was pretty devastating, and we're not seeing them come back, those jobs come back in the same way. And then the other question, of course, is what are we recovering to? And if we kind of get back to pre-COVID, unemployment's bouncing around, mid-5s, and when we kind of pull up stumps and say that's enough, we are still going to be in that world that you're talking about, Catherine, the one that you've seen for past decades, where there is a very significant lifetime earnings gap between men and women. Women are not always having the opportunity to participate in the workforce as much as they're like. So I think that's where that disconnect is coming from in the public commentary.
Yeah. And Cassandra, ACOS, obviously with your membership, you must be hearing about what this actually looks like on the front line. Where are the areas where this impact is being really acutely felt by women?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. And can I just acknowledge country where I am and thank Ecstra for both this event and also the financial support that they're giving ACOS to do more work in the employment area. So I'm thrilled and delighted about that. We've got our work really cut out for us. Look, pre-pandemic, we had got to a situation, the long tail of the GFC, Catherine, actually, where the GFC had been caused by wealthier white men. And the price is being paid by low-income women and their children. And so pre-pandemic, single-parent families had the highest rates of poverty, with about 40% poverty rates amongst the children in single-parent families. And that was essentially because post the GFC, you remember the horror budget of the Abbott government, slashing away on social services, freezing social security payments, and the story was where we were. Then the pandemic hit. You've heard from Danielle about the picture on the fragile nature of that paid work for women with caring responsibilities and what happened there. So the policies there were very bad in some cases for those women. But the flip side was the social security environment was transformed overnight. We had the doubling of the rate of job seeker. We had the coronavirus supplement extended to single parents as well. And so for the first time in 25 years, we finally had women on very low incomes actually able to confidently feed their children without lying to them that they'd not eaten that night, when, the reality was the food had become a discretionary item for single parent families. So this had transformed. And of course, that was an extraordinary relief for the families directly affected. But also, of course, it was really great for the economy. Now, the big picture, because when you give more support to low income people, it gets spent in the real economy. It was helping to keep other people in jobs. And this recovery that Danielle has painted, of course, has been underpinned by JobKeeper and the elevated rate of job seeker. We've not yet seen the effects now of what's happened, which of course the government has brought the social security payments, cut them right back. So Ben Phillips is out today from ANU highlighting that actually on the policy settings now, we will again see rates of over 40% poverty amongst single parent families, mostly women, 90% women, Danielle, in terms of social security recipients. At the same time as the government is shoveling out the door $2 billion per month in tax cuts that are going into the hands of mostly men who've got jobs, and dollar for dollar, most is going to higher income men. What's wrong with that picture? It is deeply disturbing that, of course, we've got a government that's decided again to plunge people back deep into poverty, but of course it's really bad economics. And I think we're all going to watch that, because we know again that the government is now trying to encourage people with higher incomes, again, proportionately more men, to spend their money because they've been saving it. So this is a really disturbing picture for us. And I think when you talk about Australia's record on the global index on gender equality, let's remember that we are actually, pre-pandemic, we were the wealthiest country in the world, along with Switzerland. We're not just, wealthy. We are the wealthiest.
Mm.
And of course, over this last period, because of those with wealth have actually done very, very well because of government policies and also the very low interest environments. And so this is very gendered, what this recovery could look like, unless we do it very differently. And if what we see is a heavy reliance mainly on tax cuts, with those calling, oh, now we've got to get back to fixing the budget, those critical care services like aged care, like childcare, will be again the ones where there's a flattening of, we can't spend more money in those areas because we're not prepared to raise the revenue that we need. So it's a troubling picture, but I'm also very encouraged because we've got a lot of these discussions going on.
Yeah.
Calling it out.
Yeah. We really do, and that is fantastic. And we will come back to that because I did want to talk to you more about the budget and so on. But Mariam, love to hear from your perspective. You set up MoneyGirl in particular to boost women's and younger women in particular financial literacy, give them access to tools and education. What are you hearing from the women in your cohort, younger women? One of the more troubling things that was pointed out in the Australians Investing in Women report was that a substantial number of younger women with bachelor's degrees were unemployed compared to their male peers. Really substantial number. Very worrying. And I wonder if that's something that you're hearing about and seeing.
Yeah, look, I think it is important to acknowledge that some of the solutions that we are working on are treating the symptoms of a root cause. The root cause is a system that has already been proven to be broken. So we can continue to educate women, empower women, insert 10 more buzzwords, but the problem is not that women are broken, it's that the system's broken. So at some point, the solution does need to address the root cause of where this is coming from. So yes, financially educating young women is helping. It is helping them sustain themselves in a broken system, but that's not solving their problem. The problems that we are seeing today are not new, caused by the pandemic, like Danielle and Cassandra already said. They existed pre-pandemic. And do we really want to bounce back to that world? Do we really want job seeker to go back to that world where it was already failing? We did a little experiment during the pandemic and we saw that it worked. Doubling the pay rate worked. Okay, it worked for the people, the families, but it also worked for the economy, for the local economy that is struggling right now, not just because people don't have money to spend, but because our international borders are closed. Our second biggest export is impacted because international students cannot come in. So we have seen the impact of sticking with the system. Okay, I know that we feel very passionately about sticking to our guns, like that was the system that our ancestors, well, some of our ancestors set up and we really wanted to defend it. Cool, but it's broken, right? And it broke us. During the pandemic, under pressure, it did not survive. So why do we want to go back to that system? We got to build forward and be creative about the solutions that we implement. And one of the beautiful things about being in Australia is that we are a pretty small country. And that may be a bit hard to grasp if your whole entire world has been Australia, but compared to most other places in the world, we are a perfect place to actually experiment with new creative solutions and new ways of doing things. Yeah. So the solutions that Danielle and Cassandra were talking about that include a gender lens on the budget and policies going forward, Australia is a prime place to actually do those things and lead the way for other countries in the world, because everyone is just struggling with the same things. Why can't we be the pioneers of this solution? You know, like we are always looking to the US for whatever reason. To being as being our leader, like we want to move our education system more in that direction. But why are we so scared to be the pioneers of new systems, of new ways of being? For young people, we already touched upon the sectors that were most impacted by the pandemic, right? And amongst those sectors, women are heavily employed, so they were losing a lot more jobs than their male counterparts. So their employment is affected. But you know what else is affected for young people is their employment and training. Being able to complete their employment and training and then go into more substantial employment if that is what they want. That is being impacted. Their sense of community has been shattered. Okay, this includes a lot of international students and migrants who will have come into Australia just before the pandemic, or like right at the start of the pandemic, who have been entirely isolated and who have not been taken care of in the solutions that we have rolled out so far. So Job Seeker does not take care of a lot of these people, right? So a lot of young people in vulnerable communities then fall through the cracks, and a rollover impact of all of these ways of living, ways of being shattered is mental health. And that is so crucial. Like an economic recovery that will need to be done on the backs of young people, right? How are you going to do it when they are so impacted in more ways than just economics? Because you can push out money right now, but getting an entire generation to recover health-wise from this disruption in life is going to take a long time and a lot of future injections of money. So we need to be mindful of that, and we need to be ready to put that money into action.
So, Mariam, on that, and in fact, maybe Danielle and Cassandra, I can ask you as well. People are now talking about the scarring effects of some of this and the long-term repercussions. So younger women not able to work, not able to progress, not able to save, of course, for retirement, something that I've been banging on about for a long time. Talk us through what the impact of some of these things that we've seen emerge, Danielle, from your report. What is the long-term prognosis? Because that's pretty frightening, isn't it?
It is indeed, and I think over time, kind of economists have got a better handle on this issue of scarring, and unfortunately, the news isn't particularly good. So we now understand, for young people that graduate into a weak labour market, such as in a recession, we see the impacts on their wages. Not just 1 or 2 years after they graduate, but even 5 and up to 10 years after they graduate, because they're coming in to a weak labour market. That actually just affects their whole earnings trajectory. So that is why protecting employment in a recession is so crucial. It particularly is young people. Cass mentioned before the overhang from the GFC. That has most acutely been felt by the young. So I can give you a statistic in the past decade. So since the GFC, this is pre-COVID, incomes for people under 35 had gone backwards on average. So if I gave you someone, aged 24 to 35 in 2018, they were earning less on average than someone that same age a decade before. I mean, that is absolutely extraordinary in a world where we expect that each generation will do better than the one that came before them. So that is really what's at play here. That is the risk. That is certainly why we've been saying, jobs, jobs, jobs. You've just got to prioritise running the economy harder, investing in the types of things that will stimulate the economy to bring unemployment back down, because the cost of not acting is so great.
Yeah, absolutely. And Cassandra, in fact, I saw both you and Danielle quoted in an ABC Online article today about the top tax offset running out, and the gendered nature of the impact of that. So women, in line to pay more tax, and men not. And it just struck me, it reminded me of so many conversations over the years with, shall we say, some fairly forthright colleagues at the Financial Review, who would say to me, there is no gendered tax policy, it's just tax policy. There is nothing about unemployment that is gendered. Are we getting it? Is the message getting through, do you think, that in fact there are massive gendered consequences to all of these levers? And in fact, we'll then get on to the care economy. Is that message, is that penny dropping, do you think?
Well, let's keep working on it, Catherine, because I think you know, look, to that discussion about, you know, younger people, and Mariam, you might have a comment on this too. I balk at the term scarring because, again, it kind of creates this impression that somehow you've been damaged, you know, when actually, as you're saying, this is about a system that is continuing to fail young people who are extraordinarily resilient, actually, you know, and determined to push through and to change some of the structural problems. And so I think this what we've seen in this last 12 months is when governments invest and lead and expend in the right way, and they are the best placed to go into debt, because as we know, it is the cheapest debt you can find on the markets is government debt. It works, and actually the public support goes up when you've got the government leading with what's needed in terms of both physical and social infrastructure, like care services that the community needs, like social housing, so crucial for everybody. So this rhetoric about a business-led recovery is actually very dismissive and disrespectful to all of those who have over the last 12 months led this recovery that we've all acknowledged is happening. And then I think for us to be very specific about what's happening here now with the tax arrangements, the 3 stages of tax cuts that the government seems determined to push through, and they are legislated, will cost the budget over 30 billion by the time they're all in place. And 2/3 of the benefits of that will go to wealthier men. That is a fact. And if you get into the higher income brackets, it's even more gendered, with about 40% of the benefit going to men in contrast to 15% female. In fact, the best way to target a reset on inequality and the intersectional nature of that is through the direct transfer payment system. And again, Ben Phillips was out today saying the same thing, that actually investing properly in transfer payments like Social Security, like family payments, direct money confidently that people know they're going to get, actually really works in the economic sense, because people are more likely to be continuing to spend it. And of course, we should be most worried about people who have the least, and we don't have that picture at all at the moment. Now, we'll you know, Catherine, you and I in the past have worked on women in leadership, right? It matters too, because who is around the table of the decision making on this, right? It is actually mostly men who are sitting around that table. Now, more power to the women who have been tasked with the next bit of work from the coalition government, but the central Treasury, Finance, they are the engine room of changing this picture. So, you know, I'm really encouraging, you know, both women and men to call out the facts around the tax front, because, you know, look, the government justifies its package on tax cuts as stimulus and job creating. We've done the analysis. For every job that gets created out of that tax cut package, it's costing $500,000 on the Treasury's own figures. If you were to invest dollars in aged care, for every job that gets created in aged care, sadly, it's only costing $70,000 per year. Now, if you go into construction, which of course is where the government's put a lot of its money, for every job that gets created, it's costing $300,000. How gendered is that picture? Yeah. Let's get hold of a few of those numbers and call that out. If you're really serious about jobs and stimulating the economy, you'll actually invest in care services and put money in the hands of people who really need it, including the young people of the country. Yeah. Thanks.
And Danielle, you did some number crunching around the dollar invested in childcare, early childhood education and care, and the return on that, which was quite dramatic, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, indeed, and that's just the immediate return. I mean, so this is just the return from making childcare more affordable, promoting women's workforce participation. So we found sort of more than 2 to 1 in terms of a GDP boost, and that doesn't take into account any long-term benefits through exposure of children to early education and all of those things, which we know are also really, really good. So this is just a very short-term economic payoff is there, let alone before you start talking about some of those longer-term benefits.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time, but I did want to ask Mariam, how do we make sure that some of the women that you've mentioned already, younger women who were international students potentially, very exposed to some of the terrible downside of COVID, how do we make sure that their voices, their experience is much more part of our conversation? Because that's an equally important thread to all of this, isn't it? To make sure that those things are not only that we're talking about them in the broader sense, but we're also feeding in real experience and real effects on younger women, for example. How do we do that, do you think?
That's right. And Catherine, building off of what Cassandra said, how am I supposed to do that when I'm not at the table?
Yes.
Yeah. So the Prime Minister, when the cabinet reshuffle happened, said that we now have a Prime Minister for women, right? He later rephrased it because somebody pointed out how flawed that was. It's cute. It's adorable. I admire the sentiment behind it, except that he is, right? He's my Prime Minister too. So, but he has surrounded himself with people who look nothing like me, who look nothing like and have experienced none of what it is like to be an Indigenous person on the land that has been taken away from them and they're now looked down upon. How will he know what the solutions are? A year ago, the government said, we will not know the gendered impact of this pandemic, only time will tell. And Yasmin Poole on Q&A, a young woman of color, said, well, I can tell you now, right? But you gotta talk to me. How am I supposed to tell you when I'm not at the table? So the reshuffle happened and we're all like supposed to be happy about the fact that there's a Prime Minister for women, yada, yada, yada. Mind you, that is a person who has never had anything to say about the trauma that women are experiencing in Parliament today, right? The percentage of women who are in top leadership in the ministry is still exactly the same. Yes, it is still standing at 27%. The percentage of women and what those women look like, the experiences that they bring to both the leadership parties of Australia is abysmal. I am not saying that it is just the government's job. None of the leadership is taking an active approach to have people like me, to have Black and Indigenous people on their leadership. It is not just the people who hold power right now. So, Nyerol Nguyen said to ABC after the cabinet reshuffle happened that white women right now are talking about how can they be safe in the parliament. For women of color, the discussion is how can we get to parliament, right? It's a whole different playing field. So you got to take this more seriously. Is one of the first things that we can do is like take seriously the fact that the system has just in front of your eyes been shown to be broken, and stop trying to mollycoddle a system that's been broken, okay? And move forward and find better solutions that include what Australia actually looks like on the ground and not just in the parliament. 2, show, don't tell. So you can say that you want to tackle the problems that we are experiencing head on. We want to, what was it the Prime Minister said? This will shake things up where things need to be shaken up. But the former Attorney General is back in office while he got paid leave, while women who experience trauma don't get paid leave to process their trauma. Yeah, so don't tell me, show me where your priorities are, leading to point number 3, put your money where your mouth is, right? So do all of the things that women are right now, like Danielle and Cassandra, telling you this is what you can do in order to get better outcomes for the economy and for the women of this country. So put your money behind it.
Very well said, thank you. And you're absolutely right. And it's quite a sad reflection, isn't it, on the system, as you say, but on our society too, that we're still at that point. I did want to just, before we open to some questions, as somebody who's been talking about the mantra of the gender lens for such a long time in the not-for-profit world, but equally, of course, around budgeting, do any of the panelists hold out some optimism for the upcoming budget? Do you think we've had a little bit of foreshadowing around aged care, and of course, almost automatically that means that I think Cassandra's already referenced, that means we can't spend on anything else because we're looking at aged care. What is your feeling? Because the outcry after last May's budget was pretty full on. I mean, I don't think I've seen quite that much coalescing around objection to the lack of a gender lens. Any feeling about where we're heading with this budget?
Look, I'll jump in with some reflections, and then others can as well. But I mean, I think you're certainly right, Catherine. I think there was a huge amount of criticism from the last budget, but it was because it was so stark, right? We were, what I was talking about before. I mean, we're coming out of, well, Melbourne was still in it. These lockdowns where women's jobs had been hit hard. It was, this was a services-led recession, and we saw all the money being pumped into construction, manufacturing, utilities. Not that there wasn't justified support for areas like construction, but just this huge disconnect. And any, very basic gender analysis would have been raising all sorts of alarm bells about those kind of equality questions, but that also would have actually helped direct, I think, a better economic response. Yeah. This time around, so I think the government will be a bit more cognizant. They have to do something on aged care. I mean, you cannot have a Royal Commission report sitting there like that. The interim report was called neglect. It's really sort of a stain on our national conscience. I'm concerned that they are very focused on containing costs, both in the short term and the long term. So the sort of numbers we were hearing leaked yesterday or the day before was about injecting 10 billion over 4 or 5 years. That is, an order of magnitude short of what you would need to deliver on the vision from the Royal Commission. So they talked about a move to individual rights-based approach instead of a rationed approach. They talked about improving pay and conditions for workers in the sector, to do the full package, including delivering more workers so they have more time with residents in care, actually improving services. It's about 10 billion a year. So, it's a long way short. I think there will be some movement on things to try and improve women's super balances. So things like playing super on paid parental leave, on super for women that are earning less than the current threshold for employers contributing to super. They make a difference, but you're probably talking kind of $300 a year in retirement. So, not to be sneezed at, but small in the context of the lifetime gender earnings gap and some of the struggles that women are facing in retirement. And finally, on the point about making childcare more accessible, certainly something that we've been pushing hard for a long time. It's really crucially important if you want to boost female workforce participation and start to close that lifetime earnings gap. I don't expect to see it in the budget, but I get the sense that it's not off the table. So I think the government understands, well, they should. If they want to do something for women, it's a great thing to do. And there's a great economic narrative too. That's win-win. So that one should be really a no-brainer. So I'm certainly hopeful we might see some movement on that later in the year, if not in the budget.
Yeah.
If I may, Catherine, on the budget speculation, I think, Danielle, I'd agree with you about what's likely to be in, what's likely to be out. My message is more to the rest of us about what we say about it. Mm. I think the narrative of the government's containing costs needs to be challenged. They're not. They're shoveling out the door right now $2 billion per month in tax cuts. Okay, so we need to call this out. If we get the 10 billion, I saw the lead line from journalists was, big expenditure in aged care. Now, from where we are sitting, and let's be clear who's paying the price of it, it's 2/3 women in residential aged care. Let's remember that. And in terms of workforce, it's 90% women, some of the lowest paid work in the country. Okay, so let us hold our expectations here rather than be grateful for something small, because if the government wants to hold all of its big expenditure, including the tax cuts, but also things like Home Builder. And it's just expanded the envelope on Home Builder, which is the cash going to people who've got homes, people who've got housing already, who've got extra cash already, who are able to take the benefit of that. So again, in terms of targeting, it's going to wealthier people, mostly probably men. If we got a gender analysis on Home Builder, I'd love to see it, who's getting the benefit of that. But at the same time, we get in the millions for responses on family and domestic violence. We need to say it is not enough, because that's what we're likely to see, are these very sort of tokenistic, new program, which is actually moving money around. Because for those who've been tasked with coming up with gender policies in this budget, unless they are given an envelope, which is serious, we should say this is more of gender-based discrimination rather than we're grateful for what we get.
No, good point. And who can forget last year post-budget hearing that women drove on roads as they don't by and large build them, however. Yes, that was just such a emblematic, I suppose, of that whole approach, and the fragmented nature of this. So again, we started off talking about, well, the whole nature of women's work. And when people say to me, what do you write about? What's your special? I'd say women's work, which of course includes an enormous amount of unpaid work that we continue to not value. We don't factor in. And Danielle, I think it was your report that pointed out women were doing an extra hour a day of unpaid work during the pandemic. I mean, that's just extraordinary. And to think that all these years on, from a whole lot of change that started to look as though it was going somewhere, we're still looking at that. Making those linkages and actually looking at changing the structure, as Mariam pointed out. So building back better, which is the hashtag a lot of people have been using. Have we got a moment, however, because we've all pointed out these discussions are at a level that I haven't seen in the past. I think they've been very broad. I think it's also no coincidence that we have brilliant people like yourselves and so many fabulous women in policy making and economics and so on, who are really stepping up and pushing this. Do we have a chance now to actually, keep surging forward and try and change that structure? Happy if any of you would like to jump in on that. Let's try and put our optimistic hats on for a moment. Mariam, any thoughts?
Well, look, I think it is hard to be optimistic, but I will say one good thing that being under so much pressure has done is made this conversation mainstream. So whereas 2 years ago, the Prime Minister of Australia wasn't having this conversation at a press conference, now he is. So that's nice. But you know what Cassandra was saying is, what am I supposed to be grateful that he is having this conversation now? And I'd been forgotten about for so long. So it's good that under the boiling pressure, this conversation, which was thought to be a fringe conversation that only feminists have because it is only to do with women, is now mainstream because everybody realizes that half the country is women, and a lot of the economy is built on the backs of women and on the backs of women who do unpaid labor especially. And so when they are unavailable to provide you with all of this unpaid labor, your mainstream male economy also suffers. So for that, I am appreciative, but I have a challenge for men and men like our Prime Minister who have good intentions, I'm sure, but to really step up into being the action-taking role figures as well. So instead of having a Prime Minister for women, really taking ownership over the fact that I am your Prime Minister, I represent you too, and I am here for you, and I'm going to take action, genuine action. I'm not going to throw a little bit of money to make you feel better, because we're smart people, we can see when you're doing that. But I'm going to take genuine actions on things that matter and will impact your well-being in the long term.
Yeah, and I remember at the time when the new sort of women's cabinet was announced and the Prime Minister for Women, as you pointed out, and somebody said you can't just put W in front of something and think that you've changed everything. And Cassandra, any thoughts on whether we can gather up a bit of this momentum and really see it translate?
Yes, and look, just before I get to that bit, I just want to again highlight the point that Mariam made about who's been invisible in the recovery and the destitution amongst people who don't even have access to basic social security. It's very, very serious, the number of people, mostly people who are on temporary visas, and then of course this cut down to social security back to $44 a day for job seeker. And then the call for us to freeze the minimum wage. Yeah. And what we're seeing is a bit of an effort to say, oh, terrible, local people won't take the jobs. Oh, so we need to bring people in from overseas. Now, we, of course, nation, to celebrate migration into the future, etc. We all on this call, I'm sure, say that whoever is being asked to do work needs to be paid decent pay and to have rights associated with it. And this is a moment, Mariam, where I see there's an opportunity for us to forge and lock arms on some of this, about what is to be expected here, and that we are not prepared to create, in quotes, an underclass, on steroids. Having said that bit, what I'm seeing, which is very exciting, is there is a real community activism happening, I think, politically. You've seen the performances of the likes of Helen Haynes and Zali Steggall and some of those independents in Parliament, and there is a networking going on amongst sort of challenging what kind of policies to bring, that strong voice on climate change, just saying, I'm standing up for my community. And then they've also been very strong on things like job seeker and investing in social housing, because you're so close to your local community, you see the people who have missed out, that you don't buy the big numbers on the macro picture on GDP, you see the detail in your community, and that will create a contest that's exciting for our political major parties as well. Because this is a government, let's remember, at the moment, that it's 1 or 2 seats in this at any time. And in the end, we are a democracy. And alongside that community activism, a lot of it's being led by younger people too. Excellent, but also older women. And I know there was a question there about the experience of older women who are absolutely mad as hell about what's happened for them. And that's a very powerful force to women who are right now moving into their cars because they can't afford their rent anymore, because they're back down on $44 a day. They lost the bit of paid work they had during the pandemic, and they're over 55 and they can see the writing on the wall. And it's outrageous that we're allowing that to happen. They're pretty active as well. And then there's these local communication systems, local news outlets, platforms where local communities are organising again. And some of that came from the pandemic, and so I think that's also very, very interesting and exciting. And we're here as resources for that kind of community voice. And I think we'll see more of that.
Yeah, that is quite an uplifting. And I should just quickly mention that question. We've got a couple. The face of poverty pre-COVID was a woman over 50, and women over 50 who don't get work within the next 24 months are likely not to work again in their lifetime, which is so sobering. What can we do to help this cohort as they are being fast-tracked into a life of poverty? And as Cassandra's just mentioned, that is a horrible reality. They're the ones, of course, who've never had the capacity to accrue any retirement savings, been in and out of paid work and so on. And I think it was Liz Broderick who said many years ago, poverty is to be the reward for a lifetime of caring, which is just an awful thought. Danielle, any comments on that and the effect on women over 55?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an incredibly important one. So first of all, I'll take a very big macro approach. the single best thing you can do for any group that is facing bad employment outcomes is to push the economy harder and get unemployment down. That is when those people that are at the margins get jobs. So, it's, the stuff, Cass and Mariam are talking about, have very real effects. So government pulling back too soon would be devastating, particularly for these more vulnerable cohorts. So that's number one. Number two, there are things, policy choices the government makes that can help these groups. So they have a hiring scheme at the moment. It's called Job Maker. It's not going well. It was designed to target employment for young people. There was a lot of conditions around the employee and the employer. No one's using it. You can make that scheme much simpler, remove those restrictions, including the age restrictions, and you're going to get much better take up and use of that scheme. Thirdly, where those things don't work and if the jobs are not there, we need to make sure the social safety net is adequate. So obviously, Cass has done an amazing job articulating the case for an increase in job seeker. It's very strong. We know that a lot of the people on it, despite popular perception, this is about kind of 23-year-olds playing Xbox all day. These are older women that are receiving this payment. And can I just add rent assistance to that mix as well? So the group that have really fallen behind, both when they're on job seeker, but later on the pension as well, are renters. And that's because that payment just hasn't kept pace with the cost of housing. So that's a really important lever.
Yep. We talk about the retirement income side of life, right? Everybody loves to have the discussion about, should the SG go to 12%? And, sort of the debates about, fees in the super system. Well, yes, they're important debates, but as Treasury in its report did I think its best without making any recommendations, it highlighted that actually the most serious issues in our retirement income system are for people who are not even close to that reality. And Commonwealth rent assistance is crucial. I mean, the government is saying that its direction on aged care will be to try and encourage and support people to stay at home as long as possible. You've got to have a home to stay in. Home care package is no good if you cannot even afford to rent somewhere and you've got secure housing. And so there is a reason why there are two things we push on as an organisation that is committed to ending poverty. There are two things you need. You just need to secure the basics of an income level, and that is Social Security, those things we talked about, and of course employment, Danielle. That's where we go every time. And I always say to governments that like to preach about the dignity of paid work, I say, you don't have to preach to people who have been waiting for years to get back into the paid workforce about what that means for them. You have to provide the right and the basic supports to do that. And the other, of course, is housing. And bundles of great jobs in there. And if we could get a large scale investment, including encouraging institutional investors, the super industry, to get involved in that one, that would transform lives over the life cycle. And this was a moment where we were hoping the Commonwealth would really step up and say, yep, well, let's do that one. They're not. They're playing this old type politics of that's a state responsibility. Well, I'm hoping that we've got a Prime Minister who's recognising it's not really working to keep saying, not my responsibility.
Yeah.
That's one of the opportunities for us to keep, bringing that up to the Commonwealth to say, you've shown when we actually have a strong, bolted together approach between federal and state governments, you can actually deliver very powerful outcomes. Mm-hmm. And we want more of that, not less.
Yeah.
And sorry, Catherine, if I could jump in, and when we speak about giving work, by the way, and a business-led recovery, we often fail to include the smaller businesses, the businesses that drive local economy. And speaking from a young person's perspective, where people are mostly self-employed, or well, not mostly, but a big chunk of young people are freelancing, self-employed, or running their own small businesses, but none of these qualify for either the employment benefits or almost any of the business support that has been rolled out by the government either, because like Cass was saying, most of the support goes to people who are already earning a significant amount. So both on employment and business levels, the people who need it actually fall through.
Yeah. And that's a very important point. Thank you for bringing that up. You're absolutely right. We are sadly almost out of time. There were a couple more questions, including about the mechanics of applying a gender lens to budgeting and so on. Which why don't we make a note of them, and we'll see if we can come back to some of the people who've asked them, and also encouraging younger women, but women generally, into the trades, which is another area that's fascinating. Gosh, there's been programs around that for many years now, but still very low numbers of women, clearly. And it's that classic area of occupational segregation where we have very few women in some areas that are in fact in need of labour, and vice versa, of course. But thank you so much to our panel today. I'm going to hand over to Caroline just to wrap up. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. As I said at the outset, I don't think in an hour we were going to solve all the issues around women's work and economic security, but I hope for the panellists and also our attendees that's been a really insightful hour of very diverse perspectives, and also for experts who come at these persistent problems from different perspectives.